Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Introversion podcast. Today, I'm joined by Drew Tarvin. Drew of TED Talk 7.5 million views fame. I'm honored to have him with us here today. And the story of how Drew and I met is actually an interesting one that even I am not completely familiar with. I have to jog my own memory here, and I'm hoping Drew can enlighten me as well, because I know that we met through a mutual friend. And it was because at the time I was looking into changing my name legally. And the first name that I thought of that I had been thinking about for a long time was Drew. So I was thinking about changing my name to Drew, and somebody put me in touch with you, I guess, to talk to another Drew and see what your life experience has been like. So do you happen to remember who that friend was that put us in touch?
I'm trying to think, and I don't. I don't think that I do. I'm trying to search kind of old messages and things like that because
Uh-huh.
that's my memory. I don't know if that's good or bad, but my memory is either Evernote or like email.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I looked on Facebook and we had two mutual friends. It was Arnaud and I think Rahman, my friend who I met through another friend. I think he worked at Pinterest at the time. So I don't know if it was. I don't really remember either of them introducing me to you, but
Oh yeah, it might have been Arnott. And then I'm good. Actually, Raman and I we co-host a podcast together, the PNG Alumni Learnings from Leaders
oh,
podcast. So Raman and I spent our time together at PNG, and then he worked at a startup that worked heavily with Pinterest. So maybe that's how you all got connected.
okay, cool. Yeah, I think I met him through an ex-girlfriend of mine or something. I don't know. Kind of weird how it's all how it all connects, but I find it really interesting because I really appreciated what you wrote on Facebook the other day. I know you had a long post there about racism and race relations, and I saw how you mentioned you have an engineering background and you look at things in terms of problem solving, that kind of analytical
Hmm.
approach. And I went back and I listened to your TED talk, and a couple things stood out to me that I didn't realize. So one was that you and I both have engineering degrees from Big Ten schools.
Nice.
You went
Where's yours?
so you went to Ohio State. I went to
Hmm.
Northwestern,
Okay.
and we both also ditched that corporate path to instead pursue something more creative, comedy for you. And I know it's kind of more in the realm of comedy consulting, I guess. But I guess you have done stand up and that kind of thing as well. So comedy for you, design and animation for me. But yeah, I do have a passion for comedy, and I've been jotting down bit ideas for years, and it's on my bucket list to at least try doing stand up. Um, and but at the very least, I want to incorporate more comedy into my art and design and video content. So yeah, we have that in common, and then we're also INTJs.
Yeah. Fellow INTJs. I remember I did that. So I do a bit on my personality assessments, right? That I'm a type A blue square conscientious INTJ with the sign of Aquarius.
Okay.
And an INTJ came up to me afterwards and they're like, it's such an INTJ thing to know all of your personality assessments.
Right, right. Yeah, I find it hilarious that I think statistically speaking, INTJs are one of the rarest breeds on the planet.
Hmm.
And yet I end up meeting so many INTJs, but I think it's because we're the kind of people who would be vocal about that kind of thing. We're the kind of people who we would even know that we are INTJs, whereas everybody else wouldn't even really know what they are.
Right.
You know?
We would know that we're INTJs. We would know that they're pretty rare. And we would know that also that Myers-Briggs is like, okay, yeah, it's not the perfect, most exact system in the world, but it is kind of interesting. I think we all kind of know that. So I've connected with fellow INTJs as well. And that's part of the value of things like humor or connection. It's those similarities. As soon as you have that, like, hey, I'm an INTJ, you're an INTJ, like regardless of other background, we have at least that thing in common.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing I was saying the other day, so I have traditionally tested INTJ, but there started to be a phase in my life where I was actually going more INFJ.
Yeah, okay.
And I think my theory is, because I haven't taken the test in a long time, but I feel like if I were to take it today, I would probably be back to INTJ, because and it's weird because this is going to tie in with like everything we're going to talk about today. Is like I feel like I kind of drift into the more feeling, emotional, artistic, creative side of things, but then I also drift into the more conservative upbringing that I had, and like the engineering mind, the mathematics, the logic, the analytics, the statistics. And I feel like with everything going on in our society today, right now, I feel like society is leaning way toward the emotional end. And I think to counteract that, because my personality is, I'm kind of a contrarian at heart. If everybody's going this way, I tend to go the other way, right? So if
Mhm.
society is more emotional, I'm choosing to counteract that with a more analytical side of things. Kind of like to be a voice of reason in unreasonable times is kind of how I
Mhm.
feel about it. How do you feel? How do you feel about that? Like, do you also swing that way? And given what's going on in society these days, do you feel kind of
Yeah.
more this way or that way?
I mean, I don't necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily think of myself as a contrarian in the sense of like shifting, but I think back to the idea of I like solving problems. Like that's why I do crossword puzzles. I play Minesweeper or Rubik's Cube or whatever. Like it's just things that like small things of solving problems I enjoy doing. And that's why part of why I do comedy is because there's a logic to comedy and it's almost like math with words. It's like kind of
Mm,
how do I solve this logic problem so that people laugh? But when it comes to other things, I think in a way, if I think about it, like to be a problem solver, you have to be a little bit contrarian because you have to say, okay, this is how something exists currently, and
mhm.
I think there's a way to make it better. And so, how do I make it better? And so, maybe I think of it in that regard. That certainly society impacts it because it's like, okay, what is the focus, or what are some of the biggest challenges going on right now? And okay, can I use humor to solve them, or can I use logic to solve them, or can I use an analogy to help kind of solve them, and maybe that's where the impact of society comes in.
Yeah. So speaking of that specifically, I kind of wanted to talk. I kind of wanted to dive into the racism and all that stuff going on right now in society, and then toward the end, touch on comedy,
Mhm.
um, and really get deep into that, almost kind of like a follow up to your TED talk. But since you brought up that last thing, I do want to ask you that specifically in this moment. Like, given the current climate, do you feel that comedy is effective or can be effective, or like, you know what I mean? Like, because I
Yeah.
personally, like with my podcast, the podcast I just started about a month ago, and I feel like every episode I've done has been super serious.
Mhm.
And I think people getting the initial impression of the podcast is like, oh, okay, this is a guy who talks about politics and society and really heavy issues, and it's not really a fun
Mhm.
podcast. But I'm like, no, 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 it will be fun, but not
Mhm.
now,
Yeah.
So,
Right.
but how do you feel about comedy in terms of what's going on right now?
Well, the comedy is it can be both, right? It can be something that could be so, helpful to the situation and everything that's going on. It could also be something that's so detrimental. And, I'll kind of expand on that a little bit more. The ways that it can maybe we'll start with the detrimental. The ways that comedy can be negative is one, is it can reinforce stereotypes. It can create stronger and stronger in groups, which therefore creates out groups where people aren't a part of that
Yeah.
experience, right? It can bring certain groups. So you can, whether it's the left or the right, you can meme your way to more extreme views almost in a sense. And I think you saw that some in 2016. The other thing that, comedy can be a negative for is in a good way, comedy is great for catharsis. It is a great way to relieve tension and stress, which typically is a good thing. However, if you have systematic or systemic issues that need fixing, if you relieve too much tension with comedy, then I think people are perhaps less likely to act. And some of this kind of research or thinking comes back from the days of court jesters, right? If you think about it, it would be kind of weird for a king to put in a court jester, someone that's going to constantly be making fun of the king and the kingdom. But the reason why they did it was through the jester, the audience or the people's subjects, the serfs and things like that could laugh. They could relieve tension, and they'd be like, "That's so true. That's a crazy thing." so that they wouldn't revolt. There's some research that suggests that that's the same thing for Carnival in, say, Brazil and other places, that you give people this catharsis, this fun moment, this fun week, this fun month or whatever, so that they don't look at the other 11 months of the year that are terrible for them. And so
Mm.
that's, in some ways, that comedy can be negative, right? It creates this catharsis. You kind of relieve that stress. And so then you don't go to the voting booth, or you don't get active into campaigns or other things. So that's the negative. The positive is that, one, it can create stronger, supportive groups. It can help, in a way, speak truth to power, like, to take that terminology. But what it does is, if you can get people to laugh, you can disarm them. They feel like, in order to make someone laugh, you have to understand them a little bit. And when you make them laugh, they feel like you do understand them. And so once you get them listening, there's a sales guy named Jeffrey Gitomer, who says that at the end of laughter is the height of listening. Right. So if you get people kind of paying attention and listening a little bit, then you can start to insert some messaging there. And so part of what determines whether or not it's detrimental or helpful is the material that you're doing and what message you give once you have people listening. And so that's where my approach has been, of like, okay, how can I use humor to, I don't want to preach to the choir, right? That was part of the Facebook post putting it out there, is I don't want to just kind of like talk to my bubble of living in New York City and all that, and people are like,
Mhm.
nodding their heads. I want some of the people who are either on the fence or have gone kind of the other direction to kind of be like, oh, well, that's a funny point, or, oh, that's said in such a way I've never really thought about it before. And just give that, like, inception seed of an idea to maybe be able to start to help change. Because that's my focus, is how to solving the problem is getting some people to change. It's not pretending that they don't exist or being aggressive towards them.
Yeah. Um, yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. So, um, could you give an example of, okay, so as I see it, as we all see it, let's face it, there's a divide in this country.
Mm-hmm.
There's a left, right, red, blue. And I just saw on Twitter yesterday, COVIDiots was trending.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked under there out of curiosity, which, by the way, is kind of my approach to everything happening now, is like, I
Mm-hmm.
will literally watch any video. I will listen to anyone speak, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't care if I agree or disagree with. I will literally listen to the head of the KKK speak out of curiosity. I
Yeah.
want to see what people are saying and thinking. And I feel like, not to go off on a tangent here, but I feel like they're, with kind of the way that the leftist kind of is a the leftist approach to things now, and a little bit of the kind of social justice warrior kind of methodology, is to silence people, to cancel people, to block people out, to deplatform people because we don't like their ideas. Let's just cancel them. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not fundamentally how I go about approaching anything in life. Is like, look, I might hate something, but I still want to at least understand it to the point where I know why I hate it, rather than just going by hearsay or whatever. But sorry, I just wanted to put that out there, the spirit of curiosity. But I want to come
Well,
back
and
to
that's
this. Like,
it's a valuable trait to have for humor as well. That's where your humor starts, is that curiosity. And I think that's why sometimes comedians can, they say things that you're like, oh, I've never thought of it that way, or that is so true. Why have I like never, put it in that term? And it's a curiosity, right? It's a willingness to sit back and observe a little bit, and be open to different ideas. And I agree with you on that, in the sense that, you know, if we vilify people, then they're not going to change. You're only going to double down.
right,
If we ignore people, then they're not going to change, and we're just going to pretend like it doesn't exist.
right.
It's only through learning a little bit more, and then maybe through, and hopefully through conversation. And maybe this is, naive on my part, or optimistic. I'm a relatively optimistic person,
Mhm.
but it's only through those types of conversations can you create any type of change.
Right. Agreed. So, so we're on the same page about the curiosity thing. So
Mhm.
I was curious. I go look up COVIDiots, and what it was a bunch of leftists, kind of liberal, Democrat, that kind of side. They're demonizing and mocking all the Trump supporters and I guess conservatives and Republicans who went to Tulsa to go attend this rally. And they're calling them all COVIDiots. And that is the extent of the humor. And I think that would go against all the principles you talk about when you talk about sort of a healthy humor. So my question is, that is all I see. I see it go both ways from left to right and right to left, but I see a lot of it more. I see a lot more of it from the left than the right, because I feel like people on the right, and it depends which conservatives you follow. I happen to follow, I don't know if you're familiar with Dave Rubin, but I love Dave Rubin. Like politically, he's kind of my guy. He's very libertarian in his views. He's neither here nor there. He used to be a liberal. He still considers himself a classic liberal, but now he's kind of more on the conservative side of things. But I don't see as much mocking of the left by the right as I do the left mocking the right. And I say that because most all of my friends on Facebook, so basically all of the articles, all of the links, everything that I see are all of my liberal New York, LA friends who just relentlessly have been mocking Trump and his supporters and anybody who's Republican or conservative. I mean, since before 2016, but it just gets worse and worse and worse. So all that being said, my question is, what would it look like for people on the left side of the aisle to be funny and have a healthy form of comedy that doesn't consist of just toxic attacking and shaming people with different views on the right, and in theory, vice versa?
Yeah. Well, and I think I've definitely seen plenty of mocking of the right to the left, and I think it's on both sides. Um, and I mean, you see it coming from Trump himself in terms of, and maybe this is
Yeah,
a quote unquote effective strategy of, Sleepy Joe and Crooked Hillary, and like just like
right,
COVIDiots is a nickname, right? Giving nicknames
right.
as well. And that's partially the value, like, slogans and pithy statements and things like that. They can have tremendous power because they start to, subtly influence people to, like, I don't even know where Sleepy Joe comes from, but for that base, people are then like, yeah, I guess I don't know what that means. I don't know what the negativity of Sleepy Joe is. It that he's like not strong? Is it not whatever? But it's a name that now everyone can use,
Yeah.
and it allows them to aggress, just like COVIDiots or just like Trump gret. Like the regret stuff, or on Reddit, like leopards ate my face and things like that. And in any of those spots, what I think of first is, you asked the question of what could it look like. There is a difference between humor and comedy, and comedy is really about the punchline. It's really about getting people kind of to laugh. And humor is more broad than that. It is, defined as a comic, absurd, or incongruous quality causing amusement. And so, certainly with my background in corporate, with my general optimism anyway, like even when I'm doing stand-up comedy, if it's a late show, it's a 2-drink minimum, it's 10 p.m. on a Friday night, I'm still clean, like when it comes to my material, because that's just my own kind of personal choice.
Okay.
And so I'm always kind of thinking the more positive, inclusive. And so that's why my company is humor that works, not comedy that works. That's why I talk
Hmm.
about the value of humor in the workplace, not necessarily comedy in the workplace. And so what I would say from a humor perspective, there's a great XKCD comic that is um, called the Today's 10,000. I don't remember the exact title. But basically, it's this idea of, sometimes you're in conversation with people, and it kind of happened with my fiance the other day, whereas we were maybe going to go. We went to a drive-in movie theater last night to be able to still socially distance. We saw E.T. the doubleheader. The second movie was Goonies, and she's never seen the Goonies. And part of us, like, our initial thing is to be like, how could you never see that? Oh my God, you're like so uncultured or whatever to not have seen this. And this XKCD comic does some basic kind of math to say that every single day there's like 10,000 people on the planet that are being introduced to something cool for the very first time. And rather than taking the approach of, what, you're an idiot, how have you not seen this, or whatever, you're so uncultured, why not be like, oh my God, I'm so excited because you're one of today's 10,000. You're one of today's people who get to get introduced to this Goonies movie that I grew up on, or this new thing, or this whatever. And so I think of that as kind of the same approach of, rather than kind of aggressively being like, hey, you're an idiot for this,
Right.
it's finding the positive humor to bring people in, to create this experience that people are like, no, I want to join that because it's giving me what it is that, you know, something maybe that I'm missing or that is helpful, and it's a little bit more inclusive. I don't have, if I had the exact answer, I'd probably be putting it more into to action. But right now, so I don't know what it is yet. But I'm trying to learn and understand from other groups. That there's a group called Otpor, who was in, I believe it was Serbia, who used humor as an effective way to help topple down a dictatorship to gain support. It's now a political party, and I don't know a ton of the history of it. My brother does
Hmm.
more. He teaches a course on rhetoric of humor, so he uses it as a case study. So I want to learn about it, but I think starting from the standpoint of positivity and inclusivity is going to create more of a welcoming experience than being, aggressive humor.
Okay. It's interesting, the distinction you made between comedy and humor. I've never heard that before. I've never made that distinction, I guess. Um, that's, that's good food for thought, though, to make that distinction. Do you know the comedian Dimitri Martin?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know him personally, but I know of him.
Yeah, right, right. So he's one of my favorite comedians in a way, but at the same time, what you just described in terms of comedy versus humor, I don't laugh out loud at his material.
Mhm.
Like there's other comedians who just crack me up, but with him, I guess it's more like humor to me than comedy because it's very clever, it's very artful and it's very funny, but I don't laugh at it. So I don't know. When you immediately started describing the distinction, my mind immediately went to Dimitri Martin.
Yeah, and I
Being
think that's true
more,
because comedy, the goal of comedy typically is, again, that laughter. It is to, in some senses, be perceived as funny. Whereas humor, it is, and so with comedy, it's very structured most of the time. It's very set up and punch, right? It's very set up, punchline, set up, punchline, set up, punchline, maybe punchline, punchline, punchline if you got good tags and things like that. Whereas humor, again, is a little bit different. So Dimitri Martin might be that. David Sedaris might be more of a humorist, right? Mark Twain was a humorist as opposed to, say, a comedian. And so, yeah, it is a slightly different distinction, and the goal is different. And that's what, is from the corporate side of things. That's what the reason why I teach people how to use humor is not so that people perceive them as funny, is not so they necessarily can go and do stand up, although they could theoretically after what they learn. It's more, okay, how do I now use this humor to achieve this specific result? Or like we talked about kind of at the very beginning, is how do I use humor to solve this problem? That's why my made up job title is humor engineer, is because when I was trying to define what it is that I did, right, I was a computer science engineer, and that was, okay, I solved problems using computers, technology, programming. Okay, what am I doing now? Oh, by helping organizations, I'm helping them solve problems using humor.
mhm.
And so to me, it's, oh, okay, humor engineer.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, especially with your engineering background. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's perfect. My degree was actually in industrial engineering, which I don't know if you knew this. There's kind of it's kind of mocking a nickname for it. We're called imaginary engineers. Have you ever heard that? Like we're not real engineers. We're like, but it's funny. It never offended me, that idea. But now, because I am a creative guy and I am all about imagination and coming up with things, I'm like, oh, kind of like how you're the humor engineer. I feel like imaginary engineer actually suits me pretty well.
Yeah, it's kind of a cool term. Think about it.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, so there's still a lot more I want to get into about comedy, but let's really get into the meat here, and we can maybe come back to comedy toward the end.
Mhm.
So, what kind of brought us back together was your post on race and everything going on in society right now. So, obviously, this is the topic that everyone in society is talking about and dealing with in their own way. And the interesting thing right now is I've seen a big push for, okay, white people shut up now Let's listen to Black voices. And there was one day where I got an email because, I'm sure my inbox has been flooded with Black Lives Matter emails from every company,
Mhm.
every institution, everything, as I'm sure yours has and everyone's has. But I got one email. I think it was from General Assembly. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but
Yeah. Yeah, I
um,
used to do some classes with them
oh,
or
cool,
teach some classes there. Yeah.
cool. Um, so I got their email, and then it said, we want more. It was something to do with like more support for Black and brown people. And I saw that, and I was like, oh, now I get to have my voice heard. Like, now it's like one point on the scorecard for like, all right, because I'm brown.
Mhm.
Um, so that feeling of just seeing, it was like a blip, because everything I've seen is black, and then there was one mentioning of brown, and I was like, oh, that's me.
Mhm.
So my whole thing is, I feel in a way that we're going about this all the wrong way, and I feel like the answer to racism is not more racism. And unfortunately, that is what I see happening. And when I talk about, it's on my to-do list. I want to go back and listen to Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. I want to listen to the whole thing and probably do a podcast episode specifically on that, because I feel like just from the little bit that I remember from the speech, I feel like we have deviated. The minority rights and Black rights, all of it has deviated from that core message of essentially meritocracy and equal opportunity for all Americans,
Mhm.
regardless of whether you're white, black, anything else, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman or whatever in between. We're deviating from that, I feel like, because, you know, instead of judging a man or person by the content of their character, we're judging them by the color of their skin. What I mean when I say that is that, oh, you're a white person. Oh, you need to shut up now. You know, we've heard from you long enough. You're a white male. Oh, you definitely need to shut up. You know, and for me, and it depends. Like, this is another thing. It's kind of like, okay, if we're all going to debate, if we're all going to discuss, we need to get on the same page in terms of what are the terms and what do they mean, right?
Mhm.
So, what does racism mean? What does racist mean, right? So, as I define it, and I actually looked it up the other day, and it was like racist is like the belief that one race is superior to another. That was kind of the thrust of it, and there was kind of a part B and a part C of it. But okay, so if racism is really about racial superiority and belittling and putting down another race, you know, as I see it, how is that not racist toward white people? To tell
Mhm.
people to tell white people they have to shut up because they're white, or all white people are racist. I could go on and on. I've heard this
Yeah.
expressed in like 20 different ways. So you see what I'm saying here, though, how I feel,
Mhm.
and I feel like this is the kind of thing that I can even say as a brown person, but
Mhm.
you couldn't come out and say what I just said. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that for sure, just because because it's interesting, and to your point of like, should I speak or not, and that like feeling that I am the majority. I have all of the privileges, basically, almost. I am a college educated, straight white male living in the United States, and like the only minority thing about me is that I'm left-handed.
Okay.
Which means that I, on average, will die 7 years sooner, and that I can't use
Really?
scissors. That's like my discrimination or whatever. Or I mean, the only like at least in recent memory, the only discrimination that I face on a consistent basis is that I am an Android phone user. And
Mm,
so, people don't like me because I changed the color of their text messages with
yeah.
iPhones and can't do all the other fun stuff or
Yeah. You
whatever. So I'm left
you
out
just
of group chats and other thing.
yeah, you did just list
Uh,
a couple points in my book. Yeah, for
Right, exactly. You're like, "What? Android?" Yeah. I can't do AirDrop to send you a quick photo of something. I've gotta do it on Google Drive or all like, so and I can comedically say that because I'm sitting in the majority. But to have privilege doesn't mean that you don't have strife or challenges. To be in the majority, it doesn't mean that you can't experience racism.
Mhm.
Uh it just means that the impact of it typically is pretty different. And I think, you know, it's an interesting thing about equality is that, and I don't know, I don't have enough research and everything understanding this, but equality doesn't always mean treating people equal, right? Because like you say, you have this idea of like, yeah, but can't we all, okay, meritocracy, let's judge it based off of meritocracy. If you grow up, and one of the, distinctions is also a class distinction, but if you grow up and you are learning from textbooks that are 30 years old in a classroom of 30 people with someone who hasn't necessarily, like, the teacher is doing a tremendous amount of work but isn't necessarily at the top of like the teaching game or something, or you don't have access to nutrition, right? You're constantly kind of hungry. How well are you going to study compared to someone who has all of those things provided for them? If you are in an environment where you go to an interview and you meet 7 people and none of the people that you meet are of your same makeup in the sense of, skin color or gender or, whatever, then that's a different kind of, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was an equal interview. So you have these, and this is where the systemic racism comes in, or the systemic prejudice comes in, that creates the challenge. So equality doesn't always mean treating people exactly the same. And this is true in the way that I think about it, of because some people are like, I don't know about that. But if you think about it as a leader, if you think purely corporate, if I'm going to be a good leader, right? We go back to Myers-Briggs. If I'm a good leader, I don't treat someone who has the type A personality with the same person who has a creative mindset but isn't necessarily very disciplined about how they get work done. One person, I give them a goal and allow them to go and run with it. The other person, I do continual check-ins and support. So as a leader, if I want change, drawing the strengths from people, because people have different strengths, isn't treating everyone exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the challenge, is thinking about how we think about quote unquote equality.
Yeah, that's a good point. I agree. I agree with what you said. When we are talking about privilege, there, yeah, it's kind of like the equality. The name of the equality game is kind of like leveling the playing field, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there was a fantastic, there was a viral video from a while ago, and it was a teacher. They had a bunch of students lined up in a field. I don't know if you saw this video, but it was like, okay, we're
Yeah,
going to have a race.
I
Yeah.
remember
And
that.
it's like,
Yeah,
whoever gets to me first gets $100. And then I was like, okay,
yeah,
but before we start, if you
right.
have blank, take one step forward. And so
Yeah,
then, and if you have, if your parents are still together, if you have, if they have a college education, if they have whatever, and you're just doing these different things that are basically hindrances for people's growth, and you physically see that change.
yeah,
Demonstrations like that, that's an example, not necessarily of comedy and maybe not even necessarily humor, but that's a way of framing something, and people are like, oh, you start to shake your head a little bit more, like, okay, I kind of understand it. And
yeah,
that to me is at least my, I don't know if the question is coming or not, but the question becomes, okay, why speak up? Why, as yet another male voice, do I feel that I can and or should speak up? Part of my thought is, if I am good at making people laugh, if I'm good at framing things in a way that people kind of understand and maybe have a slightly different view into, then rather than just doing that for corporate productivity, how can I also do that for perhaps social change? And I think that video is a great example of saying things in a slightly different way, so people are like, okay, I kind of understand it a little bit more.
yeah. Let me ask you: have you gotten the have you been accused of mansplaining yet?
I have from time to time,
Okay.
and also from American splaining, because my
Oh, really?
fiance is because my fiance is German.
Okay.
She was born and raised in Germany, and yeah, there's been kind of some times where I'm like, oh, but this, and she's like, no, no, I get it. It's just a different framing. So, I've been accused of it. I think I have been guilty of it less times than I've been accused of it. But it
Hmm.
is something for sure. I've been like, oh, okay, actually, no, my apologies. You're exactly right. Like I've been had to have been called on it a couple of times as well.
Hmm. Okay. Because I see a lot of that, and I just I actually okay, so I've been on this weird slight little tangent here I'm gonna go on. So I've been on this weird
Mhm,
Facebook experiment thing lately where not I haven't been unfriending everybody, but I've been unfollowing almost maybe half of my friends.
mhm,
And part of that is just for my own sanity because everything that I said earlier about all of the leftist attacks on Trump and Republicans and conservatives, I'm like, look, I don't even Trump is not my guy, and I don't, I'm not. I don't know what I am politically, but I'm not a hardcore Republican for sure. I'm not a hardcore Democrat for sure. But seeing all of the vitriol constantly, I'm like, I just can't. I just can't. I can't take it
mhm,
anymore. It's not doing any good for me. So I've unfollowed so many of these friends of mine, and what I have started doing though is when I like same thing with like your post or a couple other ones, I will kind of look at the comments underneath and I'll see some people where mostly if I agree with them, but also maybe if I slightly disagree with them, but I like how they're thinking, right?
mhm,
I will potentially, and I've done this a couple times now, where I'll reach out to that person and send them a message and say, hey, I like how you think, I like what you wrote in that post, and we'll have a little back and forth, and I'll send them a friend request. And so I've become friends this way with a couple new people in the last couple weeks, and it's cool because I feel like I'm connecting with strangers, like friends of friends, who are kind of like-minded in a way.
mhm,
um, Now I just did that with this white woman on another white woman's friend's post who lives in LA, I think, and we were on the same page about masks and wearing
mhm,
masks or not wearing masks. And so I added her, or she sent me a friend request because I said I'm open to that, and I accepted. And then then I looked on her most recent post, and she was basically all for defunding the police. And she's describing the situation in this very poetic way, like kumbaya, like, we
mhm,
don't really need police. And a white, I think he was a white male. He was definitely a male, but I think he was a white male friend of hers commented and explained something. And I think this guy actually has a background in counseling, social work. And he said, based on his experience and his life, like it's not as simple as just defunding the police. You can't put social workers in harm's way. Like these issues and problems go very deep. And so he kind of just, the guy is well
mhm,
experienced and well trained, and he said his piece. And then the woman who I just added as my quote unquote like-minded friend
mhm.
called him out for mansplaining. And I was like, oh man, you know. So again, like my sympathies go out to the white men out there because, but at the same time, what you said is true. Like you have been at the top of the pyramid for this whole time. The white straight male in America, or Europe for the longest time. And you seem to be pretty comfortable about it. You seem to be pretty confident about it, which I guess maybe that's the white privilege of after generations and generations and generations of being at the top of the pyramid. It's like you've developed the thick skin to withstand whatever assault is coming your way right now. I Tell me if
Yeah.
I'm off about that, but I get that impression.
No,
Is that
no, I mean, I think that's part of it. And I won't say that I don't like the term like woke, right? I'm not woke because certainly things happen for a long time, and I just kept on hitting snooze in terms of like trying to be aware of some of the privilege. And part of it for me started in college because I was an RA and we had to do research and things. But you're exactly right. Part of that confidence comes from that success. As growing up in the US, if I've looked for role models, I've never been at a loss for words of who's a role model in any kind of thing that I want to look at. To like, within business, I see people that look like me. I've been told also I'm, elder millennial, so I've also been told I can be whatever it is that I want. And with that has come a certain level of confidence. And there's some research to suggest that this is like a gender thing, like being a male, you're kind of just raised with that, like, you can do it and you've got it. And there's studies that show that men more often than women, if there's a job and they meet 3 out of the like 7 criteria for their job, they'll still apply because they're like, I don't have some of the other stuff, but that's okay because I can make up for it in my skill in X, Y, or Z. Like, I got this. Whereas women, they could meet 13 out of the 14, but they don't have that one thing, so they won't apply, right?
Huh.
There's a certain level of confidence just based on what they've been told kind of their entire career. And I see this with my fiance because she is way smarter than I am. She is way more disciplined than I am. And yet she goes through some of these additional challenges by the nature of the name that they see come across. And so absolutely the privileges I think that I've gained has given me confidence. And then the engineer, and this is the way that I want to try to approach things is from, because to your point, yeah, I don't want to unfollow a lot of people in the sense that I don't want to create a bubble.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest detriments to what social media does is two things. One, it rage creates more engagement. And so whether it is intentional or unintentional, social media a lot of times helps to amplify rage because that's what's going to get more retweets or what's going to get more likes or what's going to get more comments and angry emojis and things like that or bad news, etc. This is just, I guess human nature. And then two, it allows you to create an echo chamber. It allows you to create this bubble in which you live so that you only see people that are like-minded. And exactly to your point, like, I want to be able to have conversations with people. I want to on either side. To me, it just should be, let's talk facts. Let's be open to ideas. Like a friend of mine from high school recently was posting about the, like you said, kind of defunding the police and the challenges that were going on. And someone got into a conversation with them and they, shared an article about something. He made some point. So they shared an article. It was a CNN article that was explaining what defund the police really means for most people, right? Part of it is language. And he was like, first of all, I have two rules. I never read anything from CNN, which is like, okay, I'm curious then where you get your news source from. It's complete. Yeah, absolutely. There's bias there. There's bias in
Mhm.
Fox News. There's bias in CNBC, etc. But like, okay, to discount it completely. And two, and the thing that maybe made me a little bit more worried than the other is it's like, I also don't read anything that criticizes the police. And that's a hard stand to take because regardless
Yeah.
of how you feel, to say that I'm never going to read anything that criticizes this one thing
Right.
isn't like discourse, isn't growth, isn't understanding. That's more like cult-like behavior.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm not interested necessarily in those types of conversations. But yes, if we disagree on a point, I would much rather have like, let's have because that's how I learn. That's how I potentially evolve and
Mhm.
change, or that's how you potentially evolve and change if we're willing to have these types of conversations.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting though when you mention facts in there, like how you want to approach things in terms of facts, but I feel like to some degree we are living in a post-fact society. I don't
Yeah,
want to
well,
say completely, but to some degree.
we're living in people don't Well, yeah, people don't seek out facts of what's true or not true. They seek out opinions that reinforce what they already believe.
Right.
And that's perhaps one of the biggest challenges with all of this is, and that's again from good branding on the Republicans are very good at branding, are very good at simplified phrases to give hashtag like fake news. You can now almost discount anything that anyone says just by giving it fake news. And for a certain base, all they need to do is see someone who they trust of their opinion call it fake news, and they no longer count whatever that research happens to say. And you're seeing that with COVID as well. Like you're seeing it with COVID, you're seeing it with like quote unquote truths that are coming out. You're seeing it with things that people have said, and then 3 months later they say, "Oh, I never said that." And it's like, well, we do have proof of you saying it. Nope, never said it. Like people are now again, they're seeking out the opinion of people that they like that reinforce it and not looking at what the actual fact-based thing is. And so it is an interesting challenge. My wish is that we could go back to facts, but I don't know necessarily how we do that.
Yeah, I mean, I just recorded a solo episode yesterday, and I was talking about the subject of a little bit of fake news, but also I don't want to say fake facts, but it's kind of like even science. Like you can with the COVID debate, and it's like there are doctors and scientists who believe X about it, and there are doctors and scientists who believe Y about it. So at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to, like you're saying, like if I already have a preconceived belief, right, I'm going to only seek out facts that support my pre-existing, position, right? That's what you're saying. But what if I don't want to have a pre-existing, like I just want the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's typically how I operate. And I think you probably operate the same way, is when scientists and doctor over here says this, and when scientists and doctor over there says that, what do you do? At some point you have to kind of choose who you're going to believe or not.
Yeah, you have to find credible sources. You have to see and look at what the majority are saying, I think. Yeah, because you see this with, vaccines and autism, right? Because sometimes, and this, I can't remember who phrased it, but they put in, I think it was John Oliver had a great episode about this, where he's like, so often what we do is, 99% say, or you could do the same thing with climate change, but you can say 99% of experts, and I'll put experts in quotes there because, again, that, is a conversation in of itself.
Mm-hmm.
But 99% of experts agree this one thing. 1% says this. And so then in a debate show, you have them go one-on-one. And you almost like, so then we're misconstruing the fact that this is almost a 50% belief. And it's like, no, it's one debunked article about vaccines and autism from a long time ago, plus all of this research that suggests otherwise. And that's not necessarily a one-on-one thing. The other thing, I think, from what we can learn from scientists, or what I try to do is you have a hypothesis, and it should be worth testing that hypothesis. Like, you should be wanting to do that. Like, it's not necessarily, science isn't to say we always have exactly the truth, because it's constantly, this is our belief, and now we test it. And if we do enough tests, we now can kind of say, okay, our theory is kind of it. For all intents and purposes, we kind of agree that gravity exists. We can measure it. We can do it multiple times, etc. And yet it's still the theory of gravity, right? Because some things could change. We could learn things about black holes and say, okay, gravity changes it a little bit. I think what people don't do is they have a belief, and rather than ever test it, rather than ever be like, can I check that just to confirm? They just kind of like take it at face value. You see this with religion a lot, I think, right? Certain religions, you just kind of take it as doctrine because someone told you this is the truth, rather than, okay, well, is this true? And if it's this way, can I question it? And if I question it, really, if you question something and you still get stronger answers, your belief is going to be a little bit stronger in that thing, because you've at least, put some thought into it, as opposed to just taking whatever someone else has told you.
Yeah, agreed. One of the things that I have said a few times is, I don't know if you know anything about my background. I don't know if I ever told you, but I'm a preacher's kid. So I was raised in Christianity from day one. And I was a Christian my whole life. And I was actually conservative Republican. I was like the quintessential conservative. I grew up in the military as well. So, red state, conservative, Bush voting, Reagan loving Republican, like that was me.
Mm-hmm.
And I moved to New York, and I kind of evolved, and all of a sudden I found myself voting for Obama, and I was finally on the same page as all my liberal friends. And I did that for 8 years. And now I've kind of evolved into a place of disillusionment with all sides.
Mm-hmm.
Where was I going with that? Uh,
Well, it's probably a matter of, and I'm curious how those evolutions came, but I was talking about that idea of testing a
religion.
belief. Yeah.
Yeah. Religion. So the reason why I brought that up was, I see what you're talking about with religion and kind of this cultist idea of like, oh, it's dogmatic. It's purely dogmatic. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
tell me what the right thing is to believe. I don't question it. I just believe it. And anybody else who comes into my sphere who challenges me on that, well, they're the enemy. They're from Satan. They're the devil. And having grown up in, I didn't grow up in a cult, but I grew up
Mm-hmm.
in that kind of mentality. I actually see the same trends happening on the left with a lot of this kind of social justice warrior rhetoric, and even things like Black Lives Matter. And we'll get into that in a second. But it's basically like you're either with us or you're Hitler.
Yeah.
That is
Well,
the paradigm. And
Yeah, well, and like you said, with politics, it's absolutely on both sides, right? You are either like, for so many people, at least the perception is, and I think it's actually a little bit different, at least, on older research of, because I identify as an independent. Because it's like in a friend of mine also on Facebook the other day is like, it's interesting on the same exact post, I can have some people who tell me that I am, a liberal loony or whatever, and other people can tell me that I'm a
yeah,
conservative nut job in the exact same post. And it's
yeah,
like, okay, that's actually a good spot to be in,
right. I'm in
right?
the
Like
same. Yeah, I'm in the same position. Yeah.
I'm like independent, and there's certain, and let's go down by the issues. If you go by the issues, I'm probably a little bit more left leaning than I am right leaning, but it's, part of the reason why it is independence is thinking about that, the individual issues and the individual thoughts, rather than saying, "Oh, I am blank. Therefore, if liberals say all of this is bad, then okay, I'm going to say all of this is bad." Or if Republicans say all of this is bad, then I'm going to say all of this is bad. And I think, again, back to the kind of the religion kind of mindset is in either end of the extreme. If you have someone who is saying things like, oh, you can't say bad things about this person, or if they're like, oh no, this person is flawless and they don't have any, nothing they do is wrong, either one of those statements are like, okay, now I feel like you're more in the dogmatic stage than you are in the conscious stage. Because I voted for Obama as well, but it's also like, okay, yeah, there are things that in that presidency that I did not agree with.
Mhm.
That would be like, no, I would criticize, I don't know that I'd criticize it directly to Obama's face, because if I only get like, 15 minutes with him, I would love to talk about humor and basketball.
Yeah.
But if like in a longer conversation, absolutely, it'd be like, hey, what about this thing? Like, if you don't have that willingness to have a critique or to have a conversation or have some disagreement with, then that's where I think you see the dogmatic phase, as opposed to, this is just, of the, say, choices or the options out there, where I align a little bit more.
Yeah. I think so much of what we have been talking about and the issues like we're going to get into here, it's like it's all about nuance. It's
Mhm.
like these are highly complex issues that I find people are just towing the party line. And it's like, oh well, I'm on this team, therefore I have to agree with everything on this team and hate everybody on the other team. And
Yeah.
somehow we have to get out of this binary construct. You know?
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it is, and I shied away from it, and this was part of the impetus of the post to actually speak up, is that, we have been almost trained to, we talk politics a lot, but we've almost been trained not to talk about it, at least in a civil way, or all that often, or like, hey, let's get into some uncomfortable conversations. It's kind of like, we many people have been like, for whatever reason, told not to talk salary.
Hmm.
And don't tell other people what your salary is, especially if you have the same job. Like, that's, it's just uncouth, or not
Hmm.
professional or whatever. And it's like, that only helps the employer. Like, it only helps the employer, not the employee, for people to kind of know. It's like,
Hmm.
no, we can have conversation about that. And if your salary is then lower, then it's like you going to your manager and being like, okay, why is it lower? Is it because my education is lower? Is it because my output isn't as good? Is it because I'm not, the boss's nephew or whatever, right? And okay, that's more data. Like, I'm an engineer. I
Hmm.
love data. I want more data. Give me more data so I can see what I can, analyze and do with it. And I think sometimes the same is true with politics, of, rather than, we would much rather follow a campaign slogan than to get into the nuance of what the campaign slogan means. And like you said, it's nuance. It means that it takes work. And I think one of the things that, if we, and I don't know how we get there, and I don't know necessarily why we aren't there, but if political discussion was more of the norm, if it was more people kind of like, no, I'm going to do my research, I'm going to see where I stand, let's have a conversation and learn and grow, and that's part of our, you know, civil conversation that we have every day, then we could get into the nuance. But right now, because of, say, the speed of media, or social stuff that we're on constantly, or we're just all very busy, we don't get into that nuance.
Yeah. You said something there. I was thinking about it this whole time you were talking about it. So when you talked about, okay, so workers in a company not talking about their pay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is kind of the societal norm, right? Like we don't
Mm-hmm.
talk about it. And you're the first person I've heard to call that into question as if that could be a bad thing. And I've always looked at it, I mean, kind of however, I guess everybody else does look at it. I can't speak for everybody else, but I'm definitely on the same page as everybody else in terms of like, oh yeah, let's not talk about it. Because like I worked at this one company back in New York. I still do some freelance for them, but basically it was a small motion graphic design company. One guy's the boss. There's anywhere from like 4 or 5 of us freelancers at any given time. And we're basically permalancers. So we come in for a project. If there's no more work, we leave, whatever. So none of us, the 5 employees, we're not even employees, but the 5 permalancers there, we worked together in and out for several years. So we developed friendships. We're very close. I'm still very good friends with a couple of them now. Um, we never once talked about what we're making.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons are multifold because you express it in terms of like, well, it's good for the guy hiring them all. It's good for the boss.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about that. I'm processing that, but I'm also, I don't disagree with you on that. But on the other hand, I'm like playing it out in my head. It comes up in conversation with my other friend there because like it's kind of like almost going to the point of like some things are better left unspoken because it kind of turns into a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode here. You know what I'm saying? Really quick, where I'm like, oh, how much do you make? And they're like, well, I make 900 a day. And I'm like, really? Because I'm only making 700 a day. And then,
Mm-hmm.
and then it ends up into this awkward situation where, okay, I'm either going to go confront the boss about it and, hey, how come Charlie over here is making 900 and I'm only making 700? And then what is the boss going to say? Like he basically has one of 2 options. He's either going to justify why that person is making more money,
Mm-hmm.
or he's going to say, okay, well, okay, I guess I should also pay you the 900, right? Those are pretty much the 2 options, right? So,
Theoretically, and in what sense is that negative for you? Aside from a quote unquote awkward conversation, which we could talk
well,
about why it's society saying that it's an awkward conversation versus like anything suggesting that it has to be.
right. So if this is an if,
Mm-hmm.
this is just in the case of I took the information of I'm making $200 less, and then I could just sit on that
Yeah.
and feel miserable and feel like, oh man, like I feel like a lesser person than my friend who otherwise we felt like peers a minute ago, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it's made me feel worse. So let's just say I leave it there and I don't confront my boss. I'm kind of worse off. It puts a little bit of a strain on the friendship. It develops a little bit of an inferiority complex. So there's like a lot of negative consequences from that. So
Mm-hmm.
now that's if I don't go talk to the boss. Now let's say if I go talk to the boss. I go talk to the boss and he says, "Well, you know, Charlie over here, he's really good in a lot
Mm-hmm.
of ways and I would say your quality of work is here, but he does things up here." You know, and I work in a
Mm-hmm.
creative field, so it's not the kind of thing where you can quantify it like, you know,
Right.
in other professions. So he might justify that, which in my head I already kind of thought. And I'm actually giving you a real world example here because
Mm-hmm.
in this company there's a guy, and I would say he's better than me. I
Yeah.
would say he's faster and quicker. He knows everything ins and outs. He's a beast. He's an awesome designer animator. So I just assumed he's making more money than me. And at the same time, there's some other people at the company where I feel like I'm better than them. So I assume they're making less than me.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess where I'm getting at is like the idea of this maybe is better left unspoken because it doesn't put a strain on the friendships of coworkers. But also, if I go bring it up with the boss, if I go do that and then my other employee comes and sees it. Like, well, let's say the boss just gave me a raise to go up to 900, right? So now me and Charlie are both making 900. And then but the other coworkers, then they go and talk to the boss, and then it kind of develops this spiral effect of like, well, the boss can't afford to pay everybody 900, right? Or in theory.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of ends up, what is the net result? Is it better or worse for everybody?
I mean, it typically ends up being better for the employees in the sense of like, yeah, you then at least understand. For me, and this is maybe, I recognize that I'm not the pillar of which to judge emotion by, because as an engineer I also kind of consider emotions as data as well. Right, in that sense of like, okay, if this makes me happy, I want to do more of it. If it makes me upset, okay, why does it make me upset? Let me sit with that emotion, but for a period of time, and after that think about, okay, why does that make me upset? And then, can I change it? Great. Let me do that. Can I not change it? All right. Well, then work to not have it affect me emotionally so much, because I can't actually change it. And so in this sense, like, yeah, if I'm working and find out that I make less than so and so, and I go, one, my thought would be I would go and talk to the boss, because if I don't, you're like you said, yeah, it doesn't, maybe then I start to have animosity for this person who is my friend, but it's like, why should I allow that to happen when it's just a conversation? So let me go and have a conversation. And if the boss is like, yeah, your work just isn't as good, that to me is then data. And it might sting a little bit, but now I have, quote unquote, the facts, and I can say, okay, well, if I want to get to 900 a week, then maybe I need to improve or adjust my style to match what they want to do, right? Or what they see as that value. Okay, well,
Mhm.
if I don't want to change my style that way, then okay, maybe I am comfortable with 700, because I still get to do the thing that I want to do in the way that I want to do it. Or if they say, oh, you need this degree, or if they're like, that's just how it is, then it's like, okay, well, do I want to work long term for organization that treats people kind of like that? That's where we talk a little bit about, okay, well, then if you're going to say that, well, maybe I start to look for a different job where I am paid 900.
Mm.
But for me, I want I think it's the data. And the only really, I think, because would you have any problem asking your coworkers, like, hey, how much vacation time do you get? Or what hardware were you given when you started this job? Or what onboarding or things like that? Like, would you have any issue talking about other things related to, say, compensation overall as opposed to just salary?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask because I've been freelancing for so long.
Yeah.
There are no other kind of benefits. We're all kind of.
Yeah, but would you ask a question of like, "Hey, what's your payment schedule? Are you paid weekly or monthly, or are you a 1099 or a W-2, or well, you're 1099 if you're a contractor?" Would you
Yeah,
like
we were all
ask?
pretty much the same. Yeah.
But I think like for many people, it's like, oh yeah, I would have no problem asking, this question. It's just salary. Okay, so then why does salary feel different? Well, it's because we've been kind of trained to think of it as something that we shouldn't say. We've been told that we shouldn't say it. And then we maybe feel like we're going to be awkward with our peers. And it's fascinating to me that it's like, I don't know, I was watching a comedian perform, and it was we do a virtual open mic every Saturday. So as you talked about, hey, how do I do comedy? Like, come join our virtual open mic. It's supportive, it's fun. Check it out. I give feedback on people's set if they are open to it, if they want it, just from a, hey, here's perspective from 15 years of being a comedian. Here, what you can do and stuff. And we had a comedian on, and she was talking about how one of her
Oh,
ex
real
boyfriend.
quick before I forget, what's the name of it? I can include the link in the show notes.
Yeah, so all of our events are at humorthatworks.com/calendar. And so we do open mics every Saturday, improv drop-ins on a bunch of Sundays. We have some virtual stand-up and storytelling shows that we do every other week. But yeah, so all that's at
Oh, cool.
humorthatworks.com/calendar.
Cool.
But so this comedian was doing this joke about her ex-boyfriend having slept with like 5 of her best girlfriends. And, she had this joke about how she was gonna get back at her, ex-boyfriend and all this other stuff, and it was funny, but I was like, "I'm just curious, um, you know, did you get back at your girlfriends as well? Or did you, are you still friends with them?" because a lot of times we hear a story about the cheating on things, and people are upset with the guy for having cheated, but not necessarily the friend for having cheated with the guy. Just like,
Right.
some people are upset about, illegal immigrants taking jobs, but they aren't upset with the employer that employed them at a lower wage, likely
Right.
knowing that they were illegal immigrants,
Right.
right?
That's a
In
good
this same
example. Yeah.
case, we might get upset with our friends because they make more, but not necessarily upset with the person paying them more, despite the fact that the output is the same or similar. And so, for whatever reason, we sometimes, change where we're putting our, whether it's anger or our attempt to change or our emotional kind of reaction on one thing versus maybe where it can be a more effective place somewhere else.
Hmm. This is really interesting. The funny thing about this is I just had a conversation with one of my good friends. He's Puerto Rican, and we were talking about white privilege. And he said something to me yesterday, and it was like, this white guy he has a lot of respect for, tall,
Mhm.
blue-eyed, blonde hair, good-looking white guy. He got into this conversation with him, and they were talking about entrepreneurialism and risk assessment.
Mhm.
And he kind of, just to really quickly summarize, this white guy kind of told my friend, it's like, he asked about my friend's upbringing, and of course, Puerto Rican parents, and we grew up in the military and all this stuff. But he made the point that his parents are so conservative and risk averse that essentially he's inherited that. And this white guy
Mhm.
was telling my friend to maybe rethink, if you have a good idea, if you have that much of an edge in your business model, go for it. Go all in, because that's how he operates as
Mhm.
a privileged white male. So, and then he got to asking, and they talked back and forth. Apparently, this white guy, his parents were business people and entrepreneurs, and his grandparents were. And it's like, it is kind of a generational inherited thing of like, even kind of like what you're just telling to me now. It's so foreign to me in a way because I was not raised that way. I was not raised to kind of, rock the boat
Mhm.
or, speak up and express my disdain. There's that stereotype that Asians are kind of the model minority, you've heard.
Mhm. Yep.
And it's because we don't speak up in that way. We don't fight, like,
Yeah. Well,
so
and that's for sure, a form of the privilege that I got. Although you did just make me realize that there is one privilege that I don't quite have. I'm not short, but I'm not tall. If I had a monopoly on all the privileges, I'd be like at least 6'1", at least based on
yeah.
studies. You're more likely to be CEO or that kind of thing if you're a little bit taller. So that's one privilege that I don't have because I'm only
Uh-huh.
5'11".
I was I
So
was going to ask you about that earlier, actually. Yeah.
yeah, so thank you for helping me with that. But you're exactly right. Like if you have, I was uh growing up, I was told, because I did well in school. I was always academic and like that kind of thing. And I was told from my parents pretty early on, you can be kind of whatever you want to set your mind to. And neither of my parents had college degrees. And when I graduated from Ohio State and started working at P&G at Procter and Gamble, my starting salary was higher than my mom's salary after 20 years of experience because she didn't have a college degree.
Hmm.
And so part of like there's a generation, a group of people that would never then leave P&G because they like we grew up, there were times where it was tough. Like my parents did a fantastic job where we never experienced it, but looking back, we knew that there were times that we were kind of, living paycheck to paycheck, and they had a lot of stress amount, money and things like that. And so for me to get a job at P&G right out of college, I'm basically set for life in the sense that I will live comfortably, right? Because P&G pays a pretty good salary. If I do my job well, I'll have interesting assignments. I will live comfortably based off the cost of living in Cincinnati, Ohio. I will, get married, have a white picket fence, 2.5 kids, a cat and a dog, right? I'll
Hmm.
have all of those things. And so for many people, especially if you grew up kind of with this mindset of, having even less than what we had, you would maybe never be willing to leave that. For me, because I'm an engineer, I was hesitant to leave. My mom was hesitant for me to leave. But I also then put together a plan, a spreadsheet of all the things that I needed to accomplish before I'd feel comfortable leaving, because I had reasons to believe I'd be successful. I was able to save up enough money so that if I didn't make any money for a year starting this business, that if I ate ramen noodles, I could, survive. I had enough confidence to also, I did it over 3 years. It was something that I was able to do kind of part time and build up over time. That, like,
Mhm.
those are things that I wouldn't necessarily have the mindset to do, like you're saying, based on a certain way that I'm raised. And that's a form of privilege, whether it's a
Yeah.
class privilege because we were lower middle class, or a male privilege or white privilege or whatever. Those are things that impact. And so if we go back to that idea of like, well, I'll just treat everyone equal, everyone has the same equal things, and they still, everyone has 168 hours in a week. Well, yeah, if you don't have to spend part of those 168 hours worrying about where your next meal is going to come from, you can have slightly different thoughts and actions than someone who is worried about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, everything we're talking about here, I think we are kind of breaking down the nuances of what white privilege is. And I'm the kind of person where I don't ever scream and yell white privilege, but I'm also the same person who does believe it exists and it is a thing. And I think in the subtle ways that you're talking about, I agree that it does exist and it is a force. Now, the question then becomes sort of what do we do about it, right? So when we're
Yeah.
talking about systemic racism, and they're not one and the same, white privilege and systemic, they're related, but they're
Hmm.
not the same. But when it comes to the concept of systemic racism, while I can get on board with what we're talking about now, I also find myself pushing back against the sort of the BLM narrative right now that all Black people are being hunted down on the streets. Every Black person is walking out in fear of their lives. They might not make it home tonight. I don't buy that. I
Yeah,
don't.
well, I think that, one, for understanding like Black Lives Matters, and I'll admit, I think the movement has changed a little bit, has evolved from what it was, a few years ago. And also I think that either intentionally or not intentionally, some people are hearing it as only Black Lives Matter, and that's not at all what the movement is. It is, there's a fantastic cartoon that came out a couple of years ago to
With
better
the
explain
burning
Black Lives
house.
Matter. Yeah, the burning house.
Yeah.
And it's that idea, and so but I'll challenge it. I mean, I would ask you, I would say talk to some of your Black friends to ask them, because I have a friend of mine, best friend since 7th grade. He's the one that got me into improv at Ohio State. He he's Black. He grew up in Cincinnati, and he, like, we were talking the other day, and he's like, there has not been a 6-month period in my life since like 1995 that I haven't heard about a Black person dying at the hands of police. Now, obviously, there are certain cases where, a Black person is killed by the police, that it was absolutely needed, that it had to happen. Uh, but
Mhm.
we're also seeing through social media, like George Floyd did not have to die, right?
Right.
There was
Right.
no kind of resist or anything like that. That is a clear case of
Mhm.
that did not have to die, was not a threat to anyone. And you're seeing that more and more over social media. And now imagine if you've seen that, you've heard stories every 6 months for the last 15 years, no, 20 years of it. And maybe not all of us heard it, because certainly we didn't always see those news, but you can believe if it's your community members who are dying, you're going to hear about that more often, right? So we might say, well, I haven't heard it every 6 months. Well, we also haven't been pay attention to the same news. But if you're hearing that every 6 months, and then you get pulled over by the police, that's a very different experience than me sitting in a car getting pulled over by the police. I've never been nervous about my life when pulled over. I've been upset because of, like, oh, was I really going that fast? Or why are they
Mhm.
actually pulling me over? I stopped completely at that stop sign. I've maybe been annoyed either at myself or like the fact that there was a cop there, but I've never once thought this is going to end poorly. And if I make the quote unquote wrong move that I will die. But someone who's heard that story every 6 months, and he shared with me a stat that back in 2015, over a 50-week period, 100 black men were killed by police. That is twice a week. That is like, I'm a fan of kind of associations and metaphors, and the thought of that, of like, SNL only comes out with an episode every week, right? It takes them an entire week to do that. At least in the US, twice a week, more frequent than SNL coming out, there's a black person killed by a police officer. Now, me saying those things are meant to be purely fact. I'm not saying that all police are bastards, right? I'm not saying defund the police and completely have no police officers out there whatsoever. I am not saying that white lives don't matter. I'm not saying that brown lives don't matter. What I'm saying is, in this particular issue, for whatever reason, there is an increase in black people dying at the hands of police. That's where hashtag Black Lives Matters means for me. And now it's a bigger movement, also understanding the other systematic things of like, the only time I'm ever followed around a grocery store is I'm with one of my black friends. The only time I've ever been pulled over by a cop in Miami of Ohio was if I had one of my black friends in the car with me. And so you start to, if you're experiencing this type of stuff every single day, it has an impact on how you're going to behave. It's also not saying that what everyone is doing, what everything is happening is perfect and great out there. But for me, as someone in a place of privilege, I'm trying to better understand that now, so that I know what impact they're going through or what type of things they're going through, and to say, are there changes that we can make?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you there. A couple things I want to make a couple of distinctions here. So
Mhm.
the idea that you, when I don't know what the numbers are, but like whenever you're with your black friend, you get pulled over, or is it kind of like on
No,
the
yeah, it's
rare
not to say
occasion where you have been pulled over, it, it's
exactly,
been
yeah, it's not every time. No, and I don't think that people are saying, you know, yes, but and honestly, I can't say, right? You're gonna have to talk to some other people that have actually experienced of, do they feel some type of microaggression every single day? I don't know. But you can talk to a lot of friends, and they experience it quite a bit.
see like again, and maybe this has a little bit more to me with me being the quote unquote model minority, but
Mhm,
after 9/11, it was all about, okay, brown people are the enemy, right? And I remember listening to Chris Rock and like black comedians at that point talk about how, all right, now brown people, welcome to the party here. Like now brown people are being targeted, and I remember living through that time. And I moved to New York in 2002 after that happened. And when I would fly, when I would go to the airports, again, like even back then, like I was still a conservative guy, right? So, but
mhm,
my understanding was when I got racially profiled, when I'm at the airport and I noticed they spent more time with me or they took me to the side, I was kind of like kind of how your approach is, right? As an engineer, dealing in terms of logic. I'm like, does it make sense for them to pull or to stop me more than stop a white grandma in a wheelchair, right?
mm,
Now, granted, I was a conservative person then, but even still now, today, I would say, okay, I get it. You know, I can understand why I would look more the part. So therefore, there's a higher propensity of them to give me a look over or have more doubt about my intentions, right? I get it. Now, I'm being racially profiled, but at the same time, I understand why. My whole thing is like, look, treat me with respect, though. You know, don't treat me like I'm a criminal. Don't like antagonize me. Don't like abuse me. Don't, because that is just flat out wrong, But if you're basically just statistically going to pull me and brown people more out, I'm not going to stamp my foot and say, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, is what I'm saying.
yeah. But I mean, and is that okay in a country that's supposedly based on freedom, that's supposedly through in the Constitution of, all men, all persons, created equal. Is that okay? Is racial profile, because I mean, from a purely logical standpoint, or is it, I mean, you could say the same thing technically about testing, right? Where it's like testing for COVID of, well, I mean, maybe we shouldn't test because whenever we test, we get increased numbers. Well, it's like, yeah, that's how
Right.
testing works.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we shouldn't test. It means, in fact, we should be testing more because maybe the percentage of death is higher because we're only testing some people.
Hmm.
And maybe it's actually a lot more pervasive, and maybe a lot more people are asymptomatic that we don't know,
Yeah.
right? Maybe the mortality rate is actually a little bit lower, but we're not willing to do the test because also, scarily, what if it's higher? And so, yeah, I think that you still want the data of everyone. It's the same thing with stop and frisk, like that happened in New York. It was like, oh, we can start stop and frisk, and oh, we just catch disproportionately more Black people with drugs on them. But also, by the way, we're also only stopping Black people and or brown people, or whatever it is. And so I think that I understand kind of the quote unquote logic approach. I just don't know if it holds up to overall longer reason, right? Because if you do it, and if it does, then the question becomes, where does that come from, right? Because then it's like, oh well, is it because of because a lot of times it's not necessarily a black or white issue. Again, it can go back to a class issue. If you look
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Totally.
increase of like crime and stuff like that, it's more of that it's in impoverished neighborhoods, not whether they're black or white.
Yeah. I was just about to give the example of, I'm just being honest here. This is how I
Mhm.
function. And I think most people, if they're really being honest, this is how they all function as well, at least in our socioeconomic class. So I'm in Philly. I'm walking down the street. It's late at night. There's nobody else around. I see a sketchy looking guy who looks kind of homeless, kind of drunk, kind of wobbly. He's mumbling, talking to himself, right? How do I go about approaching that situation? Me, I'm extremely alert. I don't want to make eye contact with the guy, but I am keeping my eye in his general vicinity to make sure he doesn't make a move at me. I will keep a safe distance as much as I can. All of these are the little measures I will take to protect myself, right?
Mhm.
And to make sure a situation does not arrive here unnecessarily. The faster I get away from this person, the more distance I keep, the better off I will be, right?
Mhm.
So that is the honest to God truth of how I operate. And honestly, I think that's how most everybody would operate, right?
Absolutely.
Now, whether the person is white or black or Hispanic doesn't matter to me.
Mhm.
I would act the same way if this sketchy guy is white or Hispanic or black, right? So, but that's okay,
Yeah.
like I'm stereotyping to protect myself, and what you're just described, like this is based on socioeconomic factors, right? Not race,
Mhm.
but it is a form of quote unquote prejudice or stereotyping. So I wouldn't fault people for that. But at the same time, if somebody had a camera, they're walking by and they saw a white Karen,
Mhm.
um, and the homeless guy walking down was black, and she crossed the street or something, they've recorded it on their phone, she's going to be shamed for being a racist. When my point is like, well, actually, maybe partially to do with race,
Mhm.
but it's not all about race. So
Yeah.
this is
Well,
kind
and
of one of the things that bothers me about the debate these days, is that everything is being attributed to race, where I feel like race is only part of the overall equation, you
mhm.
know?
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. And I do think that some people take it to the extreme of things. And I think you see that in, a lot of different areas as well. Like, I don't know, it's you can think to like the Me Too movement, and there's a lot of, and what's crazy though is there's probably even more systematic stuff where that still hasn't come out because it's only in certain industries. But at the same time, you at least look at the Aziz Ansari kind of case,
Right.
and that's to me a different scenario than Louis C.K. or Bill Cosby or some of these other groups. It was more of like, okay, that's someone who potentially just was awkward, thought someone was into them. They weren't.
Mm-hmm.
Push, like, tried to make a move. They weren't into it. And then it's like, okay. And there was a New York Times op-ed from a woman who was like, that wasn't necessarily assault. That was just, an attempt at bad sex.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do agree that some of this goes too far, right? And again, but I'm a male, so that's a different perspective sharing that. And I think the other thing to recognize, just as you were chatting with about that, is to recognize when I'm talking about privilege, I don't mean that doesn't mean that you don't face discrimination or that you don't experiencing things that are negative. For example, male privilege is one of those where it's like, if you look at suicide rates, they are higher for men. If you
Yep.
look at there's certain challenges where, it's difficult for men as well, but that doesn't mean that male privilege doesn't exist. Doesn't mean that there are some forms of female privilege that don't
Yeah.
exist. But when it comes to that specific case, I think it's helpful to understand, the way that some of this works is we as humans make snap judgments. We make very quick decisions, and we had to, especially as evolution went on, for us to be able to survive. You need to be able to quickly determine, is that rustling in a bush a
Mm-hmm.
saber-toothed tiger or just the wind? And this is partially where humor came in. Humor is part of our evolutionary process of, like, there's a theory of humor of relief tension, of like that we laugh when we're relieved, when we have tension, and then that tension is relieved. So you thought it was a saber-toothed tiger, but it's just your friend Grog, your caveman friend Grog in the bush, there to scare you, then you're going to laugh, right? But these snap judgments help to keep us alive. Same
Mm-hmm.
thing of like when we were at a point in our kind of like the cycle of humanity that we were constantly fighting, that you had tribes fighting each other, groups fighting each other. You had to kind of make distinctions of, is this someone who's going to be in my in group or out group and keep me safe? Or are they going to potentially attack me? So certainly you need to be aware of that. I think what the work is that's involved is recognizing that we still hold those snap judgments from an evolutionary, perspective. Hopefully, we have evolved as a species that we're not at that, that we're not going to have those same challenges, and that we all have implicit bias. It's not to say that bias by itself is bad, because I have those same thoughts, right? I have that same thought of, like, if I'm walking down the street and see a certain kind of like thing, I'm going to walk to the other side. It's just more prudent or safe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's for me to recognize, okay, yeah, walking down in the middle of the night and someone holding something in their hand that might be a knife, yeah, it would be prudent for me to walk across the street. Me walking down the middle of the day and it's someone kind of like, nicely dressed, but just because of the color of their skin
Right.
that I like, walk across, that's a little bit different. And
Mm-hmm.
it's up for me to then say, okay, what is that bias? And can I check myself on it to make sure that it doesn't then impact me booking my stand-up shows, or me giving opportunities to other people, or me implementing laws that, specifically go towards or against a specific like race. Like, I think that's the work that's involved. Not to say that, oh, I'm not racist at all or I'm not prejudiced at all, but to say, okay, can I separate the initial snap judgment that I make and the actions that I take?
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I bookmarked here that I wanted to go back to is when you were talking about your black friend and how you were saying he heard, like, whatever those numbers were you threw out. Every couple months there's another black, or every week or whatever. I would I want to say, like, do you know who Tony Timpa is?
I do not.
Okay, or David Dorn?
Mm-mm. David
Okay.
Dorn sounds familiar, but I might be thinking of Game of Thrones.
No. Okay, so this kind of proves my point, is that Tony Timpa is a guy who a cop had his knee on his back and was pressing him down, and he couldn't breathe and he died.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows who Tony Timpa is, though. And you see where I'm going with this.
Mm-hmm.
He was white.
Yeah.
So part of the reason why it might seem like your friend feels like every week a black person is being shot by cops is, well, if the media is only going to cover that, then that's all that people will think is happening. You know, I just discovered this guy Tony Timpa on a whim. Like some friend of mine who's Korean and Korean and white, he sent it to me. First, he sent me a meme, and it was just, do you know who Tony Timpa is, and blah blah blah. And I'm like, is this real? My first
Mhm.
assumption is like nowadays with everything, I'm like, I don't trust
Right.
anything. So especially if it's in a meme, I'm like, all right, is this real or is this just meant to? And he's like, no, dude, it's real. And then he sent me the video link of the actual cop cam of it actually happening. And I watched it and I was like, man, I didn't know about this.
Mhm.
And I told my mom and like friends, like nobody would know about it. And if you look at the statistics and the data, cops actually kill unarmed white men more than they do unarmed black men. And this is just the statistics. And you can say, well, that's because quantitatively speaking, there's going to be more white criminal offenders because there's more white people in the country.
Mhm.
Fine. But you also have to look at who's committing most of the crimes, on a percentage basis. And they're percentage wise, more blacks are committing crimes than whites, violent crimes as well. So when it comes to drug crimes, that's really debatable and subjective. And I think we should not be arresting people just for possession of marijuana and all those kind of things.
Mhm.
That to me is definitely a point of systemic racism that needs to be rooted out. But when we're talking about violent crime, that's separate. Like violent crime is like, look, if you're robbing a bank, if you're, holding up a liquor store or whatever, mugging somebody, burglary, there's not really an excuse for that. You're committing a violent crime. That's why we have police, to protect the law-abiding population from people like that. And the majority of those people are black. So that is just us talking about cops and black people. But we have to also look at the numbers of black on black violence. And I'm sure you've heard this already now in like Chicago and inner
Mhm.
city. It's like blacks are killing blacks at an alarmingly high rate. And I've been meaning to sit down and do my research and like get all the numbers together and prepare a proper presentation of it and all this stuff. But on the other hand, I'm like, I'm not an activist. This is not my job. And, but I could do that. I may do that at some point because I do kind of want to put this together and put it out there. But from what I have seen, this is what the data points toward. So I'm just saying that to give a broader perspective of the problem with the Black Lives Matter movement is it's not even the problem with Black Lives Matter movement. It's the collective understanding. It's the story that we're all being led into going along with. And if you don't go along with that story, like somebody like Candace Owens, I don't know, do you know who she is?
Mhm.
So she doesn't go along with that story. And she's the one who actually comes out with the statistics, with the figures, and talks about all these things, these very uncomfortable things that people don't want to talk about. She does that, and she's immediately vilified as an Uncle Tom, as an Aunt Tom, as a
Mhm.
so and she's probably the only person who could get away with even saying those things because she is black and because she is a woman. Certainly a white person could not come out and say what she says because they would just be labeled. They're like David Duke,
Mhm.
they would be thrown into that bucket. Forget about facts and statistics. But this goes back to what we were talking about earlier when I was talking about like a post-fact society. Like we're reaching a level of hysteria, not reaching, we were already past the level of hysteria where the facts don't even matter anymore. Because it does come down to perception. And the friend you mentioned, your black friend, that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
It's like if we have a collective understanding that black people are being hunted down in the streets, of course there's a problem with that. Of course people are going to be up in arms but we have to be really honest about the reality. You know, I saw the
Well,
statistic
yeah.
somewhere. There's like 44 million Black Americans, something like that, and nine nine unarmed Black men were shot in 2019. I think that was the number, something like that. So I'm like, wow, nine unarmed men shot or killed by police out of a population of 44 million or whatever it was. So obviously, we would love that number to be zero, right?
Mhm.
But we would also love the number of drunk driving deaths to be zero. We would love the number of cancer deaths to be zero. We would love the number of diabetes related deaths to be zero. But do we eliminate sugar? from all food products because of diabetes? You know, do
No,
we
but
want to?
we make certain changes. So I completely understand kind of what you're saying, in that um, we should absolutely, like, we have to understand the context to which all this happens, and this is why, like you said, nuance is so important. Because I love data as much as the next person, but I also am fully aware that statistics, like, can be used in a lot of different ways, right? Because you can look at, like you said, you can look at, okay, what's the percentage of the population that is killed by police? Okay, overall percentage, it's higher. But then if you look at the disproportionate, like you said, of, okay, the makeup of the population versus the number of deaths, then it becomes a little bit uh different. Same thing of, like, yeah, you can say, oh, but black on black crime is way higher than police on black crime. But just because black people are killing other black people doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at issues of police officers doing it. Because I think that's also part of where the conversation comes in, is that there is a belief, and maybe we're wrong about it, of what is the police are meant to be there to protect and serve. That theoretically they should be held to a higher standard by virtue of the job than just someone kind of on the street, right? They should, because that's part of what they do. And so then you look at it and you realize, oh, they aren't actually given a ton of training. They aren't given training on bias. They aren't given training on de-escalation, perhaps. And I'm not saying, I don't think I could be a police officer. I'm saying it is a incredibly challenging job. But then you have groups and police officers who have violent kind of, infractions or things like that, and they just get moved to a different department.
Yeah, that's
It's the
terrible.
same thing
Yeah,
with priests that then,
right. I was about to
have
say,
an
yeah.
issue, and they move to like, that doesn't mean that, oh, well, because, with priests, it's like, oh, well, there's plenty of other pedophiles out there who aren't priests, so we shouldn't fix up, the Catholic Church. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So to
Right.
say, but black people kill more black people, so let's not worried about that. No, and you're exactly right. The nuance of, say, something like Black Lives Matter isn't, and it kind of, I don't know necessarily how much of a choice it is, but there's going to be some people that look at it and they see, yes, this is okay. I understand the systematic challenges. Yes, okay, maybe not defund. It's not defund the police completely. Let's not create a hamster dam like in
Yeah.
The Wire. But instead, oh, could more funds, instead of all of that funding, be put into giving a small town a tank? To, should we be teaching people about mental health? Should we be teaching people about, should there be more community things? And I think that's a lot of what people are talking about when they say defund the police, or not, or at least that's my interpretation of it. And again, I could be wrong, but that's, I think, what a lot of people are talking about, where it's not abolish the police completely, it's about police reform. And so how
Yeah.
do we make those types of changes? And that, of course, but that doesn't mean that, it doesn't discount any of the other things that you said, but then it also comes back to look at, okay, why is there potentially more black on black crime, or why is there more violent crime in these places, etc. And a lot of times it goes back to education, right? It goes back to, it's all kind of interconnected in these different systems. And so some of it is additional bias, right? Some of it is additional challenge. You can even look at things like unemployment. I don't know. I don't know if you listened to the 1619 podcast from the New York Times. I think it was last year, but really interesting case about discrimination against black farmers. And you can see, okay, if that's happening systematically over a period of time, you are going to see more black farmers then in poverty and things like that. Okay, and in which case, then they're going to, maybe that does lead to more crime. Again, it goes back to some of the class stuff. And this is all stuff I can't completely speak to because I don't know all the data that you kind of cited. So I'd have to certainly take a look at it and better understand that. And also, again, my perspective is that is of a white male who tries to see everything through, rosy, sunny glasses.
Yeah, I was going to say earlier, when you described yourself as an optimist, is funny because, like, I'm definitely not an optimist, especially, I don't know, like, I'm trying to process everything happening in our society right now, and I hate to use the term better or worse or good or bad. I don't like using those terms anymore because what does that really even mean?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but honestly, I don't even know. I find myself speechless now with everything. I'm like, all right, let's tear down all the statues and eradicate the mentioning of slavery from textbooks. Let's not learn from that lesson of what not to do. Let's say the Holocaust never happened. Let's get rid of Aunt Jemima. Let's cancel Uncle Ben. Let's get rid of Taco Bell, Starbucks. Like, it's just, I don't know. I don't know where we're going this. And unfortunately, we're running low on time because I did want to bring this back to the concept of cancel culture and talk about comedy and all that because, but we're running out of time there to jump into that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, I think a general, I'm an engineer, so I try to think of like, okay, what are solutions? What are next steps? And I think, at least for me, trying to really, listen to understand, really kind of connect with people who have differing viewpoints from me. Cause I'm enjoying this conversation because I'd much rather have a conversation where like, what about this? And here's some studies and things like that than I would from someone, one, that just completely agrees with me. There's an old management adage that says that if two people think exactly the same, one of them is unnecessary. In that sense, and from a purely kind of like leadership or corporate perspective, that's not like a human thing of like if two people think of the same, one of them can die. Like no,
Right.
just like in terms of a role of an assignment, you want diversity of thought, you want to be able to have conversation. And I think if more people can be at least open to it, to like, let me understand that side. What are the challenges that you have? What are the things that you want to do? Like I'm trying to do that more and more so that I can improve my understanding, so that I can gain more data and potentially change my perspective. And then I'm also just trying to check in a little bit more with myself of like, okay, what biases do I have? Because I certainly still have them. I still have those initial thoughts, but how do I then at least reconcile those thoughts and, like I said, not turn it into discriminatory action? Right, because thoughts are different from actions, and to pretend like no one is racist, I think, or no one is prejudiced or whatever is very unlikely. And so saying, okay, for myself, how do I improve? And that's the overall thing, is like, how do we, my hope is around how as society, how do we kind of like start to make some of these strides? Because I think about what could we as a human race be doing if we weren't doing something. Could we like clean up the planet a little bit more? Could we do more, space travel or something like that if we had, some of the top minds working on this type of stuff as opposed to, or I mean, even in the case of COVID, could we have less overall deaths if instead of politicizing things and trying to make it about, now suddenly the statement of wearing a mask is somehow a political statement, rather than trying to turn things like that into those type of discourse? Could we be doing more to advance kind of the entire human race? And maybe that's too lofty, maybe it's too Pollyanna, I don't know. But that's that combination of optimism and engineering, thinking about like, what could be possible.
Yeah. I like that. I agree as well. So let's wrap there. There's so many things I wanted to get into further, but if you're cool, I'd love to have you on for a part 2 at some point down the
Yeah,
line.
we'll do a part 2 for sure.
Cool. Yeah. There's just, I think one of the things I brought up in your Facebook post, I was going to talk about colored people, the term people of color. And we didn't even touch on that.
We've got a number. Yeah, we'll have to do a part 2 so that we can continue to talk and also still bring in that intersection of humor and cancel culture and all of that. It's worth the conversation.
Yes, totally. Cool. So before we sign off, is there anything you would like to share as kind of a concluding remark, or any social media or anywhere people can find you online and all that?
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, hope people are just are open to wanting to learn, to connect, not getting into that bubble, and finding people that you can have good meaningful conversations with to learn and grow a little bit. I'm certainly open to that. So if people want to connect with me, I'm at Drew Tarvin, DREWTAR, V as in Victor, IN, on all social media. So if people want to connect, reach out, have a conversation, if you want to challenge me on something like, hey, I don't know if I agree with this, or have you thought or learned or whatever about this, more than happy to have those types of conversations for sure.
Cool. Awesome, man. Well, thanks for coming on. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I hope this has been enlightening for you.
The Introversion podcast is on its way, but we've obviously got a long way to go to get to where we want to be getting to. I will certainly be doing my part in cranking out new episodes every week, but here's where you come in. If you haven't yet done so, hit that subscribe button on whatever platform you're currently listening on. That way you can obviously get notified as soon as new episodes arrive. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give a 5-star rating. It just takes a second, and it will empower the Introversion podcast to rise up and conquer the suppression of algorithms that would otherwise crush this fledgling podcast into unknown oblivion. So yeah, please leave a rating, and even better, an actual review. Just a few words expressing what you dig about the podcast honestly would mean the world to me and would really help provide the motivation to keep this baby growing. Also, I'd love to hear from you at any time. Comments, questions, or if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, send an email to podcast@introversion.com. You can also connect with me on social media. I am Jay Kaslow. That's JAYKASLO on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, pretty much wherever. I really want the Introversion podcast to be something special. Raw, informative, entertaining, experimental,
inconceivable,
enlightening, therapeutic for you and me. Let's keep the conversations going about a range of topics that affect us all. Let's rise above all the hate and sickness and sadness and strife that plague this world. Let's seek to better understand each other and ultimately live our best lives. Seriously, let's do this thing.
Thank you. Goodbye now. Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you. Goodbye.